I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist. Welcome to our 10th Heartening. We are in a moment going to talk about hope in hard times, but before we get there, I want to mention that this is the 10th of this series, and it seems like a good time to take a break. Let me know if you'd like more of these, and if so, what you want to hear about. But this whole set of Heartenings from 1 to 10 has been about taking a deeper and more spiritual perspective toward different issues that we face as people who may or may not be interested in religion at all, but we do feel called to some kind of a deeper sort of life. And we're looking for inspiration and perhaps hope, which is the topic for today. I wanted to be able to offer something that people could hear that was different from the depressing, overpowering glumness of so much of the news. And people could take it in and just say, well, I feel better for having heard that. So I hope I've accomplished that. So we've talked about all kinds of things in this series of videos. We've talked about the nature of spirituality and also nature spirituality. We've talked a little bit about spiritual experience and why it's not a form of madness. All kinds of different topics. And so for today, I wanted to get into hope, and I'd like to start by saying what I think hope is not. That seems like a good place to begin. So, hope for me, when I say, hope is good to have during hard times, is not denial. Denial and hope have nothing to do with each other. Denial sounds like I'm not going to think about what's hard. I'm not going to dwell on it because experts will take care of it, or it's an illusion, or something like that, right? So that's for me not what hope is. And a lot of the people who attack hope attack that. They attack denial, and where they say, hoping is a form of fantasy that takes us away from the difficulties of the moment. I don't see that as hope at all. I think that's a form of hopelessness, pretending otherwise. So I certainly don't advocate that. Hope also is not waiting for a certain outcome. And it's always struck me that in some languages, like Spanish, the word hope also has the secondary meaning of waiting or expecting, in the sense that it's a form of getting active. And that's what Joanna Macy calls it, the activist Joanna Macy, active hope, as opposed to passivity, just waiting around for mom or dad or expert to solve things. So that's definitely not hope. So hope, as I hold it, has to do with starting from a position of, and we go back here to the first heartening, the title of it. It doesn't have to be this way. That things don't have to be crummy or desperate or violent or unjust or whatever it is. That things can be better, we can be better, we can do better as a species. And we have. We have done better. So for me, hope begins with a position of recognizing that what we're facing is not set. It's not permanent. We don't have to put up with it. And one of the quotations I'm going to read you at the end to send you off on a hopeful note addresses that pretty squarely. So hope begins with the certainty that things can be better, that we can do better. And then hope for me is a form of enchantment. It's a form of wonder. And hope takes in the things that are being done well, the things where we are better, the situations where we are better, and says, let's have more of that. I think we can do something like this ourselves. So hoping is hoping forward. It's an activity of the spirit and the soul and the mind, not passivity, not waiting for things to improve. The best way to guarantee that nothing improves is to think it's going to automatically. And the philosopher William James once said something along the lines of, when people are simply certain that things are good, they have very little investment in making them good. So hope is an investment in making things good, as I'm holding it for this presentation. Now, there's, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of people attacking hope, defending themselves psychologically from the very possibility of hope. And I want to talk about that a little bit too before we go on. And so I think, especially when you read the global news, invasion of privacy, climate chaos, wars going on, and so on, hunger, racism. The cynical position about all that is the easy position. It's relatively easy and requires very little to just say, well, it's all up with us. We're doomed. We're gonna wreck this planet and that'll be the end of us. That doesn't ask anything of you. You don't have to step up to anything. You don't have to see things differently. It's a useless position in many ways. It's not a form of realism. It's a form of derealism. And it just really doesn't do us any good to think that way. So that's why I don't advocate it. It gets us nowhere. There's no and then what once you conclude that things are done and that we're done and we're all doomed. Also, I've noticed that where the defense part comes in is it's a defense against the responsibility of working for change. If you think there's no point, then you don't have to do anything and you don't have to be responsible and you don't really even have to hurt as much. So that's why I say it's a defense, not only against hope, but against heartbreak. Because those of us who dare to hope are willing to have our hearts broken again when things don't work out the way that we want them to. So cynicism in general, not just in terms of an attack on hope, but in general, cynicism comes from a place of deep woundedness, and it's an unwillingness to get hurt again, even though being fully open to life requires that we have that openness again and again, even though we get hurt again and again. So I'm not convinced of the either sincerity or value of attacking hope, just generally. It's never resonated with me. It doesn't inspire me. Quite the opposite, actually. So another piece for me of genuine hope, not false hope, which is the passive kind, what we were talking about earlier. It's the child position that adults shouldn't have. The child position of mom and dad will fix it or what have you. But for me, genuine hope always has some dimension of a word I use a lot, enchantment. There's something inspiring about being hopeful, especially when you're around other people who are also hopeful. And then before you know it, it's growing into a movement. So some years ago, I coined the word enchantivism to refer to how a lot of people in the world are starting from places of deep injury, injustice, what have you, some kind of massive rupture. And they're moving beyond that to a position of, but this is how things could be. So they're daring not only to hope, but to actually give us images and sometimes performance and music that indicate how the future could be if the injustices and ruptures were removed. Enchantivism is an act of imagination and daring. And as such, I think it makes a very nice complement with hope. There's an implicit hope in enchantivism. I think too, as I read back continually through the wisdom of many cultures and ages and people, that there's something about that provides what we might call noetic hope. Now that word, noetic, is sometimes defined as mental or intellectual. I think that's way too narrow. Noetic in the sense of philosophical perhaps, and even imaginative. So when I read Lao Tzu or Socrates or Jesus or any of these wise people, I talked about Muhammad in the last video, and there's many others. They've given us so much to be with, to ponder, to move forward with. And so that can provide a source of hope too. These are all people who believe deeply in humanity. whether they said so straight out or not. And the evidence is in what they left us. Who would bother to leave any words of wisdom for a hopeless species? The hope is intrinsic. So that's the kind of hope I'm talking about. And it's also, and I want to develop this a little bit too, it's a hope that has to do sometimes with meaning and purpose, which can grant a sense of hope. Somebody with a strong sense of purpose will find a way to move forward, even in conditions of great adversity. So those definitely go with hope, meaning and purpose, being able to make meaning out of what you're doing. But there's another part that I think spiritual people in general will identify with, and that's presence. That beyond purpose and meaning making is presence. The presence of something larger than us, the presence of a sense that there's an intelligence abroad in the world and in the cosmos, that it not so much sits back and plans out our lives in some human dictatorial way, but more a general sense making, a general creativity, as the philosopher Whitehead would put it, that's loose in the universe, that continually makes things evolve and grow. So presence in that sense, and also presence in a more personal sense when we get into situations of hardship or adversity, or we're just in a state of existential nausea because we've been reading too much of the news. So the presence here is when we make the move of just saying, I don't know what to do about any of this. This is larger than me. I'm not sure which way to go with it. I don't know how to proceed in my life. And so what's next? And then you listen for dreams, or you listen for happenstance events that seem meaningful to you, or suddenly somebody raises something in a conversation and it's the answer that you've been looking for. So when you're sensitive to these things, regardless of what you believe in terms of how they work, they do work. That a lot of us have this happen all the time. When you do that, when you're sensitive, you open yourself up to forms of wisdom and noetic hope that wouldn't exist for you just inside you as an individual. And yes, there's a lot of emphasis, especially since the human potential movement. Wisdom is inside. Well, sure it is, and so are a lot of other things. But it's not just inside. When you're in a stuck situation and you work with your dreams a lot, and you ask your unconscious, or the maker of dreams, or God, or however you think of it, whatever your framework is, you ask somebody who knows more than your conscious mind for some kind of signal about how to move forward, you'll get one. You may have to be patient, but you will eventually get one. So that's what I mean. The hope that, and the expectation that there's something else listening, something else that has us in mind, however we conceptualize it, that it's not just up to us as individuals. And I find that a very hopeful thing, because like anybody else, there are times when I have no idea how to move forward. And so sometimes even after I talk to wise friends or colleagues or whoever, I still may be in a place of, I think I'm now more confused than anything, which, Socrates might have said is progress. But then there comes a response. So I mean, in terms of presence, I mean that as well. Something shifts. And it doesn't really matter how it works, at least to me. I just know that it works, and I've relied on it for decades. So hope in that sense, too. Now, I mentioned in our 5th video something called the Way of the Sage that is a preoccupation of mine more and more as I get older, actually. And that, for me, is another path of hope, where we tell ourselves some version of, no matter how chaotic and just viciously nonsensical life is on every side, there's a choice that we always have, which is to try to walk in the way of wisdom. And with that, according to the sages of many countries, China, Africa, you name it, Greece, the way of wisdom is also a way of trying to be more humane. And so there's something about walking the way of the sage, as we may understand it, that encourages other people to do likewise, to seek wisdom, which comes in different varieties, including what the Greeks knew as practical wisdom. A lot of people have that in their cultural background. Um, Humaneness, I mentioned, empathy, kindness, and other things that are associated with the figure of the sage. Also, imagination. So, from Hermeticism, there's a whole path that goes all the way back. I've mentioned this before too, to ancient Egypt, where imagination is actually a form of knowing deep things about ourselves and the world. So, the way of the sage includes that. Um, this is something that I will probably be speaking more about and writing more about. I'm not sure I'll do it in this format. I may. So let me know what you think about that. But I think over the next year or so, I'm really going to put more out in the world about my understanding of this. I regard myself as a sage in training. I don't know if I'll ever get there, but for me, it's a meaningful path to walk in a dark time. So I'll have a lot more to say about that going forward. I want to mention too, and this kind of reaches back to what we were talking about in terms of presence, that the name that I came up with, or that found me years ago, for my entire body of work in the world, whether it's psychological, parapsychological, story based, based in imagination, what have you, is world reading, because it all has to do with those traditions that are found all over the world of being able to make some kind of symbolic sense of the things that happen all around us all the time. It's a way of stepping back into the great conversation, which I mentioned in a previous Heartening. It's actually in the title. Because everything speaks. Some of us think even objects speak. But however you imagine it, there are insects, animals, organic things on every side that are constantly talking to each other. Not in the human sense, of course, in the sense of a verbal language, but always interacting with each other, always aware of each other's presence. And we used to feel like we were part of that conversation. And for a lot of heavy cultural reasons that go pretty far back, we don't anymore, a lot of us. Some of us still do. So, by and large, part of how I deal with hope in a dark time, as Rebecca Solnit's book of that title puts it, is by working on reading the world, on getting a sense of what other kinds of consciousness are up to, other entities, beings, presences, what have you. That I'm part of always a larger conversation, that there's more happening than just our human concerns. And I actually find some comfort in that. So I want to mention too, there's a term that J.R.R. Tolkien came up with that I've always rather liked. And this speaks to what we're talking about as well. He called it eucatastrophe, EU catastrophe. And he's using the letters EU. It's part of words like eudaimonia, which means that's been translated as happiness. It's not quite right. It's more like living in accord with your innermost daimon or spirit. And eucatastrophe for Tolkien refers to those situations where everybody thinks that all hope is lost. There's no way out of this abyss, and then suddenly things change. The eagles show up and carry everybody to safety, that kind of thing, right? And Tolkien in his letters talks about how much he loves eucatastrophe in life and in fiction also. And so eucatastrophe often happens when, as a person or as a culture, we're in such a state of deep peril that something beyond us organizes itself or moves itself forward or surfaces somehow and shifts our perspective such that we can move forward again. So I recommend, in terms of hope in hard times, to be looking out for the eucatastrophes, the moments where reversals are in the offing. They may not fully show yet, but they're out there and they're waiting to ride into the wings. And it's not a matter of, the party of desperate people being saved by the cavalry, although it can take that form. but it's more like a crack opens in the depressing walls on every side, and some light gets in, and we thinking of the Leonard Cohen song now, and suddenly we realize that maybe things weren't exactly as we thought they were. They're not as hopeless. So one other thing too, I wanted to leave you with. I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I think now that we wind up this 10th heartening, and again, I hope these have been at least somewhat useful or uplifting or what have you, consciousness expanding. But I wanted to read you a few quotations to send you on your hopefully heartened way as you go forth in life and do your very best. So here are a few things to take with you. The first one refers directly to hope, and it goes like this: hope is paradoxical. It is neither passive waiting, nor is it unrealistic forcing of circumstances that cannot occur. To hope means to be ready at every moment for that which is not yet born, and yet not become desperate if there is no birth in our lifetime. There's no sense in hoping for that which already exists, or for that which cannot be. Those whose hope is weak settle down for comfort or for violence. Those whose hope is strong see and cherish all signs of new life and are ready every moment to help the birth of that which is ready to be born. Erich Fromm, from his book, The Revolution of Hope. This next one is 4 lines from a poem. Come look up with kindness yet, for even solace can be sourced from sorrow. We remember not just for the sake of yesterday, but to take on tomorrow. Amanda Gorman, from her poem New Day's Lyric. The road must be trod, but it will be very hard, and neither strength nor wisdom will carry us far upon it. This quest may be attempted by the weak with as much hope as the strong. That's J.R.R. Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings, speaking through his character Elrond, whom he considered wise. The dead are dead. The great and mighty go their way unchecked. All the hope left in the world is in the people of no account. That's Ursula K. Le Guin from Tales of Earthsea. And then I got 2 more for you. The first one's a little longer. This is Hermann Hesse talking. People claim that I have no sense of reality. The poems I write, as well as the little pictures I paint, do not correspond with reality. When I write, I often forget all the demands that educated readers make of a proper book, and above all, I really do lack any respect for reality. I deem reality as the last thing one need concern oneself about, for it is, tediously enough, ever present, whereas more beautiful and necessary things demand our attention and care. Reality is something that one should under no circumstances be content with, and under no circumstances worship and revere, for it is accidental, the flotsam and jetsam of life, and it can be altered in no other way, this shabby, consistently disappointing and barren reality, except by our denying it, and thereby demonstrating that we are stronger than it is. Hermann Hesse, Life Story Briefly Told. And our last one is, and you will be like a watered garden, and like a spring of water whose waters do not fail. Those from among you will rebuild the ancient ruins. You will raise up the age-old foundations. And you will be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of the streets in which to dwell. That's from the book of Isaiah. May the week bring you blessings.